everyone. This is Professor Warren, and today we're going to go a little bit more into arguments that utilize ethos. So, very quickly, right, we talked about in the Understanding Arguments lecture that ethos is one of the appeals you can use when you're trying to persuade your audience. And when you use ethos in whether it's a speech, you're writing, a paper, what have you, you're using your credibility or your ethics to persuade your audience to believe you. Some of the things that you should do is consider these few questions when you're trying to utilize your credibility to persuade your audience. The first one is, again, if it's not your message, if you're listening to someone else, and they're utilizing their credibility, say for instance a celebrity endorsement, right? Maybe LeBron James is trying to sell you a pair of shoes, right? Consider that speaker, right, as well as their message. So for instance, if for some reason the celebrity endorsement that they have is a scrupulous person, right? Maybe they're not a good individual, maybe they are known to have been in financial debt, or they've been, maybe in past situations where they tried to push a product that either was a rug pull or just wasn't a good product, right? You should also consider some of their background, right? Just because, say for instance, LeBron James, is selling shoes, right? Is he ultimately the best person to be selling those shoes, right? Should we have someone who's knowledgeable in footwear, or maybe even knowledgeable, right? Maybe a foot doctor, right? Up there telling you why these shoes are good. Not to say LeBron James doesn't know shoes, being an athlete, but very much, right? Consider that person more in depth than just their title or just their credibility. Ask sort of the surrounding questions about that person. And that also goes for yourself as well. If you're trying to utilize ethos in your argument, just ask yourself, right? Am I the best person to speak on this subject? Do I need maybe others' ethos to sort of bolster my own? Especially since you're students, you don't have a degree, right? And maybe limited life experience. So that's always, one of the good things about writing. You can incorporate other voices into your own argument, and they can help to sort of bolster your ethos. Also, you should sort of consider these two things, right? Students will often say, well, I can't utilize ethos in my paper because I don't have a personal connection, and or maybe I'm not an expert in the field. And you definitely don't have to have both, and you don't have to have, one in particular. Let's say personal connection, right? Say you don't have a personal connection in the argument you're making, but maybe you do have experience in it. So for instance, I teach writing composition, but I don't have really a personal connection with like writing tips, right? I have a degree in literature, and so I have much more of a personal connection with literature, but that's not to say I don't have good credibility on, how you construct your paper, what should be in your paper, how do you make it flow, etc., right? And that also goes for being an expert in the field, right? As a student, say you wanted to write a paper on the way the university could improve its student services, right? You definitely don't have to be an expert in that field, right, of how to run a university, but your personal connection, right, and your expertise of being a student and being around the services, utilizing them if they're available, that definitely does give you good ethos or credibility. So just be aware, right? You don't have to have a personal connection to have good ethos, and you don't have to be an expert to have good ethos. But you do, if you don't have one or the other, you do need to let your audience know, again, hey, I'm missing this one thing. Maybe I'm not an expert in the field, but I'm credible because of, X, Y, or Z, right? So again, you don't need these, but make sure you're upfront with your audience why you're still a good, credible source. And this goes into sort of claiming authority, right? Anytime you utilize ethos in your argument, you have to claim authority. This way your audience is aware of why you are making this speech, paper, what have you in the first place. So some ways you can construct these authoritative ethos, because again, nobody wants to listen to a speaker who's beating around the bush, who's not assertive, who's not clear with why they're, the end-all be-all in the subject, right? Is be bold and personal. So again, be bold. Why should we believe you? Be upfront. I'm a doctor in this field, or I have 20 years experience in this field, right? And be personal about it, right? Engage your audience into that conversation. And one of the other easiest ways you can do this is attaching a title. So, for instance, if you have a degree, if you have PhD, you can plug that into your name, and that title can help to bolster your ethos. But if you don't have any of those fancy titles, you could also just utilize simple titles, right? Going back to the student university example, right? You could attach the title of student to yourself to sort of establish those ethos. Or again, maybe you are a volunteer worker at, a particular charity, right? That could be a title that you could give yourself. And that does very quickly and very easily attach some authority to your argument. Be open and coming clean about motives. These sort of go hand in hand, right? As we all have been moving through this semester, one of the things that I've been stressing to you all is to be skeptical, right, about arguments, right? Don't go in there fully trusting them. Be open, but be critical and skeptical about who's making the claims, right? And so another good way to claim authority is be open about why you're making this argument and the motives. One of the things that I like to do, especially if someone's trying to sell me something, is I'm very on the defensive. I don't want to just fully believe them. I'm completely defensive. I question why they're here, why they're talking to me, what they will achieve if I give them my $20 for something, right? So, if you were to open a paper and be open and come clean about your motives, that helps to claim authority, and people might be more receptive to listen to you if you're upfront and open, right? One of the other things that students tend to think is that that only an individual can claim authority, right? Like say for instance, a doctor, a student, what have you. Individuals can only claim authority. It should be noted that companies, nonprofit organizations, and other big sort of groups of people can be an authority on that subject. So for instance, if you like Apple products, right? And they mentioned, oh, hey, we have this new phone out. It has all these features. You should buy it, right? That could be claiming ethos or claiming authority, right? Because they have experience making those types of products. And depending on your view of their products, that could be enough to make you buy it, right? So again, realize it's not only just individual people who can claim authority, organizations and businesses and corporations can do that as well. So, I sort of mentioned when we talked about, how to construct authoritative ethos. These are just some additional ways you can put ethos or establish them in your writing. The first one is show you can listen, acknowledge people's values, show them respect, establish common ground. Sort of like that stance of openness we talked about in understanding arguments. So one of the first things you can do, right, especially if it's a debated issue, is just be upfront and be respectful of people. So for instance, say you wanted to give a lecture on healthy eating, right? And you're a nutritionist, right? You may say to your audience, as a nutritionist with 10 years of experience, I understand that eating healthy is difficult. But here are some tips you can do to eat healthy on a budget, right? You could show respect to those people, right? Because again, you don't want to go in there, especially if, for instance, you take into consideration your kairos or your context, and maybe you're speaking at a public community event, right? You might have people from lower income backgrounds, and so you don't want to talk over them and call them, lazy or slobbish for not picking healthy food, because maybe they actually can't financially buy higher quality ingredients. So always, consider that. Show people respect. Don't, call names. Establish your ethos while also sort of respecting other people's values or, just some common ground there. Another way to establish your authority is showing your homework. This is why in papers they ask for you to source things, to pull sources, because other sources like facts and statistics, as well as other people's experiences, can bolster your argument, right? We talked about triangulation, which is pinpointing whatever is true, utilizing various sources. And that establishes authority because you can show, hey, as the messenger of this argument, I not only can claim that, hey, I know about the subject, but here are other people to help validate my position, right? So again, having sources can help to establish your ethos. It shows that you are knowledgeable on the discourse around that subject, as well as other people's credibility can help to sort of bolster your own. And then examine your motives. So again, whatever you're doing for this, speech, essay, what have you, right? Why are you doing it? And consider that why. So for instance, if you really want to help people eat better, right? Examine those motives and say, okay, well, if I really want to help maybe financially struggling Americans eat healthy, I need to, understand their values, where they're coming from, and explain my credibility in a way in which I'm not speaking over them or speaking underneath them. I need to understand of their financial situations, and I need to come clean with, hey, here's my motives. I genuinely want to help people. I have all of this experience, and here's some tips, right? So again, utilize these sorts of methods if you want to utilize ethos in your argumentation. And this goes into the Baldwin versus Buckley debate because I think this is a good case study of ethos. Now, this is by all means not the only appeal Baldwin uses. He definitely uses logos and pathos in his argument. But I think a lot of it is ethos, and it's a good case study on how to do ethos effectively in your argument. So, if you've never heard of James Baldwin, well, you have now, so good on you. James Baldwin is one of my favorite authors of all time, and he was born in 1924, and he died in 1987. He originally was born into poverty, but rose to be one of America's greatest intellectuals and writers of all time. He not only wrote essays and novels, but he also was a poet and an activist and a playwright, so he has a lot of experience under his belt. And most of the things that he wrote concerned with issues of race, religion, masculinity, sex, class distinctions in the United States. And in a lot of his novels, they often feature gay or bisexual men as the protagonist, and that was because he was also gay. And so it's really interesting to read something that was very much incredibly controversial during his time. Here's some of his other works I have listed at the bottom. This is by no means all of them, and certainly not all of my favorites, but these were a few that came to mind. So if you end up liking him after watching this debate, definitely go read more of his stuff. He is a wonderful writer. Now, the person he's debating is William Buckley. Buckley was born in 1925, and he died in 2008. And he was born into wealth and privilege. So, I'm already mentioning some ethos about both of our speakers. So maybe, pick up on that as you're listening to them, right? Baldwin was born mostly into poverty, and he's African American. And then we have Buckley, who is white, who was born into extreme wealth and privilege. He was also a conservative author, publisher, and commentator, and he's also considered the father of current-day American conservatism. So you probably have an idea of what his viewpoint is. I really consider him the poster boy of some of the vile racism that existed in the country during that time. He very much embodies a lot of the bigotry and hate of his time, and you will see that when he actually, makes his argument. And I have just a very interesting, we'll put it like that, interesting quote of his, and I think that gives you a perspective on his ideology. But it's taking a stance of openness, right? At least listen to Buckley, what's his argument, even if it may be incredibly flawed. So, as you're listening to this debate, I want you to consider a few things, right? What was the debate about? So again, they have, for this debate, because it's a structured debate, like a debate club almost, but it's at Harvard. I want you to consider, what that debate was about. What was their main question, right? Because they're given a sort of debatable topic. So what was that debatable topic? And then what was Baldwin's main argument versus Buckley's? Also look at the way in which Baldwin and Buckley established their ethos. So how are they establishing their ethos, as well as the language that they use to establish those ethos. So how does Baldwin establish his ethos? What is his language is doing that, as well as with Buckley, right? How does he establish his ethos, and what in his language is he using to do that? Also look for any of the additional appeals. So again, are they utilizing pathos and logos as well? And if they are, how are they doing that in conjunction with their ethos? And Buckley in particular, what makes his appeal fail? Other than the ridiculousness of his claim, what strategies does he try to use that just ultimately fall apart? Now again, the main fallacy of his argument is his position, which you will see. I'm not going to, give you any spoilers, but I also want you to just look at, the actual mechanics, right? Does he not utilize his ethos effectively? Does he not utilize his pathos or logos effectively in conjunction with, the stance he takes on that? So,